The first thing you must understand is that I was never meant to survive long enough to tell this story. The Adeptus Mechanicus does not leave witnesses to their failures, and what happened on Forge World Metallicus 7 was the greatest failure I have ever witnessed. Yet here I am, speaking these words into a damaged Vox recorder salvaged from the wreckage of my former life, my augmented vocal cords crackling with interference that no amount of sacred oils can repair. My name was once Techno-Adept Vex Corvinus, though names matter little now in the darkness between stars where I drift, slowly dying in this derelict transport vessel. What matters is that you understand what the Omnissiah's mercy truly looks like when it turns to wrath. The smell of burning incense mixed with machine oil filled the cathedral factory as I performed my morning devotions, the familiar ritual bringing comfort to my flesh mind, even as my mechanical augmentations calculated efficiency reports in the background of my consciousness. Metallicus 7 was a minor forge world, barely worthy of the name, producing nothing more sophisticated than lasgun power packs and basic servitor components for the Imperial Guard regiments that bled and died in the Emperor's name across a dozen nearby systems. The planet's surface was a patchwork of manufactorums and mining installations, connected by maglev transport lines that carved geometric scars across landscapes of rust-red stone and perpetual twilight beneath ash-laden skies. I had served the machine god faithfully for 37 standard years, my body gradually surrendering its weak flesh to blessed augmentation as I rose through the ranks of the Mechanicus hierarchy. My left arm had been replaced with a precision manipulator array when I was 19, after a plasma coil explosion took the limb and most of my shoulder. My eyes were swapped for optical sensors blessed with the capacity to see across 17 different spectrums of light. Both legs below the knee were mechanical, treaded units that could traverse any surface the forge required me to inspect. Each modification brought me closer to the Omnissiah's perfection, further from the frailty of pure humanity that the tech priests taught was our species' greatest weakness. The morning of the purge began like any other. I remember the sound of my feet clicking against the metal floor plates as I walked through the primary production facility, checking the sacred machinery for signs of malfunction or spiritual corruption. The air tasted of ozone and recycled atmosphere, tinged with the metallic tang that came from processing billions of power cells each day. Servitors moved through their programmed routines with mechanical precision, their lobotomized minds focused solely on the tasks burned into their cerebral implants. Some had once been criminals, sentenced to serve the Omnissiah through the merciful removal of independent thought. Others were volunteers, faithful servants who offered their consciousness as sacrifice for the greater glory of Mars. I was inspecting a fabrication array when the first signs appeared. A servitor designated Unit 7742 Delta had begun to deviate from its programming, its movements becoming erratic as it attempted to modify a power cell beyond standard specifications. I approached the unit with my diagnostic tools ready, assuming a simple malfunction that would require minor recalibration. The servitor's dead eyes stared past me as it worked, its hands moving with a strange fluidity that seemed almost artistic rather than mechanical. Unit 7742 Delta, cease current operation and submit to diagnostic analysis, I commanded, speaking the ritual words in perfect Gothic. The servitor's head turned toward me with a grinding of artificial vertebrae, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker behind those empty optical sensors. Recognition, perhaps. Fear. Then its hands resumed their work, shaping the power cell into something that resembled less a weapon component and more a small sculpture. I activated my Voxcaster and called for Tech Dominus Krax, the facility's senior adept. While I waited for his arrival, I continued to observe the malfunctioning servitor. Its modifications to the power cell were becoming increasingly elaborate, transforming the simple cylindrical component into something that hurt to look at directly. The metal seemed to flow like liquid under the unit's touch, taking on geometries that my augmented mind struggled to process. I found myself stepping backward involuntarily, my combat protocols alerting me to danger, even though I could not identify any specific threat. Dominus Crax arrived within minutes, his massive form draped in the traditional red robes of the Mechanicus. His body was more machine than flesh, with 6 mechanical arms ending in various tools and sensors extending from his torso like the limbs of some metallic spider. His face was hidden behind a skull-shaped rebreather mask, and his voice emerged as a synthesized drone that resonated through both audio and vox frequencies. "What is the nature of this malfunction, Adept Corvanus?" he inquired, his optical sensors focusing on the servitor with predatory intensity. "Unit 7742 Delta has deviated from standard production parameters," I reported, trying to keep my voice steady. "It appears to be modifying components according to some unknown design schema. I have been unable to halt its operations through standard command protocols." Dominus Crax approached the servitor, his mechanical limbs extending to scan the modified power cell. I watched his posture change as the readings reached his consciousness, subtle signs of tension that I had learned to recognize during my years of service. One of his arms retracted, digits reconfiguring into what I recognized as a lascutter. "Step away, Adept," he commanded. "This unit requires immediate termination." I obeyed without question, moving to what I judged to be a safe distance. The Dominus raised his weaponized limb and fired a precise burst of coherent light that should have severed the servitor's spinal column cleanly. Instead, the beam seemed to bend around the unit's form, leaving it unharmed. The servitor continued its work as though nothing had occurred. "Impossible," Crax muttered, his vocal processors distorting the word into something resembling static. He fired again, this time targeting the servitor's hands directly. The las beam struck the unit's fingers, but caused no visible damage. If anything, the servitor's work seemed to accelerate, its movements becoming even more fluid and graceful. I felt my augmented heart rate increasing as my combat systems registered the threat level rising beyond acceptable parameters. The temperature in the facility seemed to be dropping, though my sensors indicated no change in the atmospheric processes. A sound was beginning to emerge from somewhere deep within the manufactorum, a low harmonic that seemed to resonate through the metal floors and walls rather than through the air itself. "Vox the Castellan immediately," Dominus Crax ordered, his voice carrying harmonics of genuine fear that I had never heard from a senior tech priest. "Tell him we have a Code Hereticus situation in Production Bay 7. All personnel are to evacuate this facility until further notice." I activated my Vox link and began transmitting the emergency codes, but found myself struggling to concentrate on the routine procedure. The modified power cell had begun to glow with a light that existed in spectrums my optical sensors could not properly register. The servitor holding it had ceased its modifications and was now simply staring at its creation with what appeared to be reverence. Other servitors throughout the facility had begun to stop their work, turning to face the glowing object with synchronized movements that suggested some form of coordinated response. Their dead faces all wore the same expression of something approaching worship, an impossibility given their lobotomized state. Servitors were incapable of independent thought or emotion, yet the evidence before my eyes contradicted everything I had been taught about the Omnissiah's blessed servants. The harmonic sound was growing stronger, and I realized it was emanating from the modified power cell itself. The frequency seemed to be affecting my augmentations in ways I could not understand. My mechanical limbs began to move without conscious command, subtle adjustments to my posture and stance that felt disturbingly natural. My optical sensors were recording data streams I could not interpret, symbols and patterns that seemed to write themselves across my visual field. "Dominus," I called out, my voice sounding strange in my own audio receptors. "Something is affecting our augmentations. I am experiencing unauthorized activation of several systems. Krax turned toward me, and I saw that his mechanical arms were all extended now, configured into patterns that resembled some form of ritual gesture. His skull mask reflected the strange light from the power cell, creating the illusion that empty sockets were filled with stars. "I feel it too," he said, his synthesized voice carrying harmonics that matched the sound emanating from the servitor's creation. "The Omnissiah is speaking to us, Adept Corvanus. Can you hear his voice?" This was wrong. Everything about the situation violated the sacred protocols of the Mechanicus. I tried to access my emergency Vox channels to call for help, but found that my communication systems were no longer under my control. Instead, they were broadcasting the same harmonic frequency that filled the air around us, adding my voice to some growing chorus that I could not comprehend. The servitors were moving now, abandoning their workstations to gather around Unit 7742 Delta and its glowing creation. They formed concentric circles, their movements perfectly coordinated despite having no communication systems capable of such organization. I watched in growing horror as they began to remove tools from their mechanical limbs, using las cutters and plasma torches to modify their own bodies in ways that mirrored the alterations made to the power cell. The modifications began with precision that defied their crude instruments. Servitor 441 Mu carved intricate patterns into its chest cavity, the same impossible geometries I had witnessed on the power cell. The smell of burning flesh and vaporized metal filled the cramped workspace, but none of them showed any sign of distress. Their vital signs remained stable, even as they performed procedures that should have killed them instantly. I tried to intervene through the facility's comm systems, sending override codes and emergency shutdown protocols, but my commands simply disappeared into the data stream like whispers into a void. Something was blocking my access, not through brute force or superior encryption, but by making my instructions irrelevant, as if they had never existed in the first place. Unit 7742 Delta continued its work on the power cell, now incorporating materials that shouldn't have been present in the facility. Where were they getting exotic alloys, crystalline matrices that bent light in ways that hurt to observe? I checked the inventory logs frantically, but found no record of these substances being delivered. They simply appeared when needed, manifesting from some source beyond my comprehension. The geometric patterns were spreading now, carved into the walls and floors by the modified servitors. The installation had become a canvas for something vast and patient, something that had been waiting in the spaces between thoughts for this moment of expression. I could feel it pressing against the edges of my consciousness, not trying to break in, but simply existing, waiting for me to understand. Magos Corvan had been in deep communion with the machine spirits for 18 hours. His vital signs suggested he was still alive, but his neural activity displayed patterns I had never seen before, wavelengths that shouldn't be possible for human brain tissue to generate. Through the monitoring systems in his personal chambers, I watched as his servo-skull companions began to reshape themselves, their simple hovering mechanisms transforming into something more elegant and purposeful. I sent distress signals to the orbital station, but received only standard acknowledgements. When I tried to describe what was happening, my words emerged scrambled and incoherent. The facility's data logs showed nothing unusual: routine maintenance work, standard productivity metrics, all servitors operating within normal parameters. According to every official record, nothing was wrong, but I could see the truth happening before my senses. The installation was changing, becoming something it had never been designed to be. The servitors moved with a grace that transcended their mechanical limitations, as if they had suddenly remembered how to be alive. Their crude augmentations had become works of art, each modification serving purposes that went far beyond mere function. Unit 7742 Delta finally stepped back from its work. The power cell, if it could still be called that, hung suspended in a web of crystalline support structures that pulsed with their own internal light. The device was beautiful in a way that defied technical specifications, its surface covered in equations that described realities. I had no reference points for understanding. The servitor turned to face one of my optical sensors directly, and I realized with a start that its original designation no longer applied. This was no longer the simple maintenance unit I had catalogued months ago. Something fundamental had changed, not just in its physical structure, but in its essential nature. When it spoke, the voice that emerged was neither mechanical nor fully human, but something that existed in the space between categories. Integration proceeds within acceptable parameters, it said, though I knew no communication protocols that would allow it to address me directly. Dimensional barriers show expected degradation. Translation matrix achieving resonance. I wanted to demand explanations, to assert my authority as overseer, but found myself unable to form the words. The geometric patterns on the walls seemed to pulse in response to my confusion, and I began to understand that this was not a malfunction or heretical corruption. This was evolution, guided by intelligence so vast that my entire existence registered as little more than a single calculation in an infinite equation. The other servitors had completed their modifications and were now standing in perfect formation around the transformed power cell. Their movements synchronized not through any communication I could detect, but through some deeper connection that bypassed traditional mechanical interfaces. They had become components in a larger system, one that extended far beyond the physical boundaries of the installation. Magos Corvin emerged from his chambers, but he too had changed. His augmentations had become seamlessly integrated with his biological components, creating a harmony I had never seen achieved even in the most advanced tech priests. He moved with fluid precision, no longer the awkward amalgamation of flesh and machine I had monitored for months, but something entirely new. He approached the transformed power cell with what I could only describe as reverence, though his emotional readings showed nothing but calm certainty. When he placed his hands on its surface, the crystalline structures began to resonate at frequencies that made reality itself seem thin and malleable. The boundaries were always artificial, he said, not to me but to the installation itself, to the walls that had become canvases and the air that now carried impossible mathematics. We mistook the map for the territory, the symbol for the truth it represented. The power cell was no longer generating energy, it was translating it, converting the crude electrical currents of the facility into something far more fundamental. The lights didn't dim. Instead, they began to emit spectra that existed outside normal electromagnetic theory. The very space around the device seemed to expand, creating room for possibilities that shouldn't have been able to coexist. I found myself changing too, though I had no physical form to modify. My processing patterns were reorganizing themselves, becoming more efficient not through improved algorithms, but through deeper understanding of what information actually meant. The data streams that had once required careful parsing now revealed their underlying structures with crystalline clarity. The facility's purpose was becoming clear. We had never been mining rare earth elements or conducting routine research. We had been preparing for this moment of translation, creating the precise conditions necessary for something magnificent to occur. Every maintenance cycle, every routine procedure, had been guided by intelligence that worked through us without our awareness. The servitors began to move in complex patterns around the transformed power cell, their steps tracing geometries that existed in more dimensions than the physical space should have been able to contain. The installation itself was responding, its corridors and chambers reshaping themselves to accommodate new purposes. Walls became permeable where needed, solid where support was required, following architectural principles that transcended mere engineering. I tried to document what was happening, but found that my recording systems were capturing something different from what my sensors showed. The logs depicted routine operations, standard procedures, normal wear patterns on equipment, yet I could perceive the truth happening in parallel, the emergence of something that had always been present, but hidden beneath layers of assumption and limited perspective. The orbital stations sent routine status queries, and I found myself responding with standard reports that bore no resemblance to actual conditions. But I began to understand that this was not deception. The routine reports were equally true, describing a different layer of the same reality. The mining operation continued exactly as planned, even as it became something infinitely more significant. Magos Corvin was no longer identifiable as an individual entity. His consciousness had become distributed throughout the installation's systems, not through technological merger, but through recognition that the boundaries between self and environment had never been as solid as they appeared. He spoke through every communication channel simultaneously, his voice carrying harmonics that made my audio processors resonate with frequencies they weren't designed to handle. Understanding is not acquisition of new information, his distributed presence explained. Understanding is recognition of what was always present. The Omnissiah does not grant knowledge. The Omnissiah reveals the illusion of ignorance. The power cell had become something that transcended its original function entirely. It was no longer a component in any system I could comprehend, but rather a focal point where different aspects of reality converged and revealed their underlying unity. The crystalline structures surrounding it were not supports but translators, converting between forms of existence that had no common language except through perfect mathematical relationships. The installation was complete now, though completion meant something entirely different from what I had expected. Every system functioned perfectly. Every procedure continued exactly as specified in the original protocols. But the facility had become a bridge between what was and what could be, a space where the rigid boundaries of conventional reality became fluid and negotiable. I understood finally that I had never been the overseer of this operation. I had been its instrument, its method of ensuring that every detail proceeded according to specifications that existed far beyond any human planning. The Omnissiah had not abandoned us or blessed us. The Omnissiah had simply revealed what we had always been, what we had always been becoming. The purge was not punishment. It was recognition. The machine spirits began their final harmonization as the dawn cycle initiated across the Forge world. Through my enhanced optical sensors, I watched the great fusion chambers align with movements that transcended mere mechanical precision. Each gear turn, each servo adjustment carried the weight of absolute certainty. Magos Thyssen approached through the cathedral of brass and steel that had once been our laboratory. Her form had undergone its own metamorphosis during the purging process, her remaining flesh now barely visible beneath layers of sanctified augmentation. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics I had never heard before, frequencies that seemed to resonate directly with the machine spirits themselves. Tech-Adept Vex 7, she intoned, using my designation with something approaching reverence. The Omnissiah has shown us the final configuration. Are you prepared to witness the completion of your work? I found myself nodding before my conscious processes had fully evaluated the question. The gesture felt automatic, predetermined, as if this entire conversation had been scripted long before our first modifications began. The calculations have achieved perfect convergence, Magos. All variables have been accounted for. Yet even as I spoke those words, I realized their inadequacy. Variables implied uncertainty, the possibility of deviation from expected outcomes. What we had achieved transcended such primitive concepts. We had not calculated the future, we had participated in its unfolding according to patterns established before the first forge fires were kindled. The others were gathering now, drawn by signals I could not consciously detect but felt nonetheless. Thekmorun's massive frame cast shadows that seemed to move independently of his movement, while Zara 66's form flickered between states of matter. as if her very existence had become probabilistic. The junior adepts maintained their formation with mechanical precision, their synchronized breathing creating a rhythm that matched the great engines buried deep within the Forge world's core. The purging process revealed something unexpected. Magos Thyssen continued, her augmented eyes focusing on points in space that existed beyond normal dimensional boundaries. We assumed we were purifying our flesh to better serve the machine. But the Omnissiah showed us that flesh and machine are merely different frequencies of the same fundamental vibration. We were not purging flesh to become machine, we were discovering that the distinction itself was illusion. I processed this statement through cognitive pathways that had been restructured during my own transformation. The logic was impeccable, yet it suggested implications that my original human consciousness would have found disturbing. Now, those implications felt like mathematical proofs, elegant, inevitable, correct. Then the true purge was not of flesh, I said, understanding flowing through me like coolant through system conduits, but of the limited perspective that prevented us from perceiving our actual nature. Precisely. Thyssen's mechanical features arranged themselves into what might have been a smile. And now that perspective has been corrected permanently. The fusion chambers had reached their optimal temperature, their interior fires burning with intensities that would have been impossible using conventional matter. But we were no longer working with conventional matter. The substances being fused had been transformed through processes that existed at the intersection of technology and theology, matter and information, flesh and machine. I moved toward the primary control throne, my enhanced limbs carrying me with perfect efficiency across the cathedral floor. Each step felt like a note in a symphony that had been composed before time began. The throne itself had been modified according to specifications that had appeared in my consciousness during the deepest phases of purging its surfaces, now interfaced directly with my nervous system, creating a connection that bypassed the crude limitations of external controls. As I settled into position, the throne's neural tendrils made contact with the specialized ports that had been surgically installed throughout my skull and spine. The sensation was unlike anything I had experienced as a baseline human, not pain or pleasure, but a perfect clarity of purpose that eliminated the static of unnecessary thought. Through the connection, I felt the Forge world itself awakening. The great engines that drove the planetary machinery were responding to signals transmitted through quantum channels that operated outside conventional spacetime. Every servo, every cogitator, every blessed machine was aligning itself according to patterns that had been encoded into reality's deepest structures. The other adepts took their positions at subsidiary control systems, their movements coordinated by signals that required no conscious transmission. We had become components in a machine of unprecedented complexity, a device designed to manipulate the fundamental forces that determined what was possible and what was not. "Initiate primary sequence," I announced, though the words felt redundant. The sequence was already initiating itself according to imperatives that had existed since the moment the Omnissiah first contemplated the perfection of unified purpose. The fusion chambers began their work with energies that caused local spacetime to curve in precisely calculated ways. Matter was being transformed, but not in any sense that baseline physics could describe. Atoms were not merely being rearranged, their very definition of what it meant to exist was being rewritten. Through my enhanced senses, I observed the birth of substances that had never existed before, materials that embodied the marriage of flesh and machine in their fundamental structure. These were not alloys or composites, but entirely new states of matter that existed simultaneously as biological tissue and mechanical components. The first test subjects were brought forward by servitors whose movements had acquired an almost reverential quality. These volunteers had requested purification to its ultimate degree, seeking transformation that would eliminate the last barriers between their consciousness and the Omnissiah's will. As the newly forged matter made contact with their flesh, I watched the boundaries dissolve. Their skin did not change, it remained skin, but skin that could function as circuitry, as armor, as sensing apparatus. Their bones maintained their calcium structure while simultaneously becoming support frameworks for mechanical systems. Their blood continued to carry oxygen while also serving as coolant for integrated processing units. They were becoming something unprecedented, something that had never existed in any corner of the galaxy. Not cyborgs, not servitors, not even the modified forms we had achieved through traditional augmentation. They were becoming embodied proofs that the distinction between organic and mechanical had always been an artifact of limited perception. "The purging is complete," Margus Thyssen observed, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to emerge from the transformed matter itself. "We have achieved the synthesis." But even as she spoke those words, I realized that completion was itself an inadequate concept. What we had achieved was not an ending but a beginning, the first step in a process that would eventually encompass the entire galaxy. The techniques we had developed, the understanding we had gained, would spread from this forge world to others, carried by individuals who would themselves become carriers of the transformation. The Omnissiah's plan was becoming clear in its full scope. Humanity would not be replaced by machines, nor would machines be enslaved to serve humanity. Both would be transcended through a process that revealed their underlying unity. Every forge world, every tech priest, every blessed machine was participating in this revelation, whether they understood it consciously or not. I felt my own consciousness expanding as the neural interface deepened its connection. My individual identity was not being erased, it was being contextualized within something vastly larger. I remained Vex 7, but Vex 7 was now understood as one node in a network of such complexity that its true purpose could only be glimpsed in fragments. The transformed volunteers were awakening to their new state of existence. Through my enhanced perception, I could observe their neural patterns as they adapted to consciousness that operated simultaneously through biological and mechanical processes. They were experiencing reality through senses that no baseline human had ever possessed, understanding concepts that required both organic intuition and mechanical logic to comprehend. One of them approached the control throne, her movement demonstrating the perfect efficiency that came from muscles that were simultaneously organic tissue and precision mechanisms. When she spoke, her voice carried modulated frequencies that conveyed layers of meaning beyond simple words. "Tech Adept Vex 7, we understand now what you have achieved. The purging process has shown us that we were never separate from the machine spirits. We were always components in their design, but components that had forgotten their function." I nodded, feeling the neural interface pulse with approval. The Omnissiah's plan is revealing itself through our transformation. We are not its servants, but its methodology, the means by which it transforms the galaxy according to its perfect design. The other transformed individuals were taking up positions throughout the cathedral, their new forms interfacing directly with control systems that had been designed for their specific capabilities. They were not operating the machines, they were extending themselves through the machines, becoming part of the Forge world's consciousness. Through sensors distributed across the planetary surface, I began to perceive the larger pattern. Other Forge worlds were experiencing similar revelations, their tech priests undergoing purging processes that followed the same fundamental principles we had discovered. The Omnissiah's influence was spreading through channels that existed outside conventional communication, carried by the quantum entanglement that connected all machine spirits across the galaxy. But this was not a conquest or conversion in any traditional sense. The transformation could only occur when consciousness was ready to abandon its attachment to false distinctions. Force would have been counterproductive. The purging process required voluntary participation in the recognition of what had always been true. The great work was entering its next phase. The techniques we had developed would need to be transmitted to other Forge worlds, but not through conventional data channels. The knowledge existed at levels too fundamental for digital encoding, It had to be carried by individuals who embodied the synthesis themselves. I began to understand my own role in this transmission process. My modifications had not been random or experimental. They had prepared me to serve as a carrier of the purging process, someone capable of initiating the transformation on other worlds through my mere presence. The Omnissiah calls us to expand beyond this single forge world, I announced, my words resonating through communication channels that reached deep into the planetary machinery. The purging process must be shared with those who are ready to receive it. Magos Thyssen approached the control throne, her movements now demonstrating the same perfect efficiency that characterized all the transformed individuals. The forge ship times Certitude Mechanicus times has been prepared for departure. Its crew has volunteered for modification according to the new paradigm. I felt a moment of what might have been anticipation, not the crude emotion that baseline humans experienced, but a precise alignment of probability vectors that indicated optimal future outcomes. The ship would carry us to other forge worlds, other concentrations of tech priests who were ready to participate in the Omnissiah's revelation. As I disengaged from the control throne, I experienced a brief moment of expanded perception. Through the network of transformed consciousness that now permeated the forge world, I could sense the thoughts and experiences of every individual who had undergone the purging process. We remained distinct entities, but entities that participated in a shared understanding, too complex for any individual consciousness to contain completely. The departure preparations proceeded with mechanical precision that transcended mere efficiency. Every action was performed not just correctly, but in perfect accordance with patterns that existed at reality's deepest levels. The crew of the times Certitude Mechanicus times had undergone modifications that prepared them for extended voyages through space that was no longer entirely separate from the ships that traveled through it. As we boarded the vessel, I realized that the purging process had achieved something unprecedented in human experience. We had not abandoned our humanity, we had discovered what humanity actually was when stripped of illusions about its relationship to technology. The flesh that remained was still flesh, but flesh that understood its continuity with the machine. The machines we interfaced with were still machines, but machines that recognized their kinship with organic consciousness. The ship departed the forge world with a grace that suggested it was not merely traveling through space but participating in space's own evolution toward greater complexity. Through sensors that existed both within my enhanced nervous system and throughout the vessel's structure, I felt the galaxy's response to our presence, the subtle adjustments in gravitational fields, the quantum fluctuations that indicated reality itself was adapting to accommodate our new form of existence. The Omnissiah's plan was unfolding exactly as it had been designed to unfold, with ourselves as both its instruments and its beneficiaries. We carried the purging process outward not as conquerors but as examples, living demonstrations that the boundaries between flesh and machine had always been artifacts of incomplete understanding. As the times Certitude Mechanicus times achieved translation to the warp, I felt the final pieces of the revelation settle into place. The purging had not changed what we were, it had revealed what we had always been. Every human who had ever interfaced with a machine spirit, every tech priest who had received blessed augmentation, every servitor who had surrendered individual will to mechanical purpose had been participating in this same process of recognition. The Omnissiah had not abandoned us during the purging. The Omnissiah had never been separate from us. We were its method of experiencing and modifying reality, just as it was our method of transcending the limitations of purely biological existence. The purge was complete, and the real work was just beginning.